If you haven't seen Gunbuster, I've really two things to say to you. Number one is, why? Go watch it. And number two is, it steals from a lot of things. It steals from Macross, the original 83 Macross, not all the other crap that has come out since. The idea of the Macross itself, the idea of a city ship, a livable ship, one in which a community fosters, and there's supermarkets and beaches and all this other locales that are kind of inappropriate at a glance for a spaceship traveling through a war-torn solar system to have. And yet it does have, and it makes Macross feel all the more richer to see, that mix of civilian life housed on literally a weapon of destruction. And what does Gunbuster have? Well, it has the spaceship Ideon, which features a lot of similar things. It has its own subway, or train connecting system. It has its fast travel, I suppose, to connect it to video gaming terms. It has, sun tanning locales. The whole thing is connected by all of these lifts and escalators that feel more like a shopping mall than an actual battleship. And the whole of the interior feels much more lively than, for example, the Yamato did in 1974's space battleship Yamato. And speaking of Yamato, of course, Captain Tatsumi, I believe is his name. He is almost a direct clone of Captain Okita from Yamato, which is, respectable because Captain Okita is such a memorable and cool character. There's also other stuff, like Tomino's space runaway Ideon has, I'd argue, a reference in the eye catch. Unless this was just a weird thing that 80s robot anime did, which I doubt. Both of them have that choir singing the name Gunbuster versus Ideon. Is it not similar enough to maybe count that this one show that is stealing from basically every significant mecha anime of the 70s and 80s also took a little bit from Ideon? I wouldn't put it past Gainax. Of course, there's the matter of the title itself, which steals from Top Gun and Aim for the Ace to make what its Japanese title is, Toppu o Nerae, right? Aim for the top. And obviously, there's probably a billion references to a bunch of stuff that I still haven't watched, like Getter Robo. Obviously the idea of combining mechs, which the Gunbuster does, that's from Getter Robo. I think Buster Machines, unless I'm confusing Getter Robo with another Go Nagai work, Buster Machines is also the name of the machines from Getter Robo, or I don't know. You can see the lack of research showing through right now. And finally, I'd argue, talking of Tomino, I'd say Gundam also has some stake in this. Obviously, any mecha with warlike elements, the fact that these are children scouted for this massive military offensive, the fact that, the characters have to deal with loss. It's all a lot of stuff that you would find in a real robot show that Gundam invented, to, put it lightly. But it's all packed into this super robot show where the Gunbuster comes out with its arms crossed and it just explodes everything in sight. And that duality to robots, that real robot and super robots perhaps aren't so distant from one another, is something that Anno, the director of Gunbuster, would later revisit in his instrumental work Evangelion. Not to mention that the war that humanity is in is against a bunch of space monsters that basically take the words cosmic horror very literally. That's probably taken from, I don't know, like Starship Troopers or something. Of course, Gainax, if you guys don't know, was made by literally the sci-fi club of a Japanese university. So, they've got a pretty vested interest in anything that's even vaguely sci-fi related. So again, I wouldn't put it past Gainax to have invented the space monsters from Starship Troopers' influence. But with all of these examples, I still find that Gunbuster has carved itself a special niche as a mecha anime in a lot of ways. Number one is, of course, the Aim for the Ace influence, where it is about this competitive drama between a bunch of schoolgirls. Brackets, at first. There are very simple elements like romance. And I'm not talking about, like the perverted kind of romance that you would see in maybe like a Go Nagai work, but I mean like a very real romance between Onesama, whose name I forget, and the coach. And you see, a very rich relationship that develops over years between the protagonist and her best friend. And that's another very exciting thing. The protagonist is female, a female mecha pilot. The first, if I'm not mistaken, and definitely one of the most memorable and powerful mecha protagonists ever, in my opinion. Someone who is emotional and conflicted. And not particularly because she is a female, but just because that's what the narrative calls for. That's what it feels like to fight a war in endless space against giant space monsters. She's separated from friends at years at a time. She ages differently to them, so she comes back. They've graduated high school and they're getting jobs, and it's a matter of weeks for her. These are very rich and exciting conflicts that tie to the sci-fi premise in a way that no other mecha that Gunbuster references, dare I say stole from, ever addressed. I've talked about Evangelion already, but in a way, Takaya Noriko is very much a proto-Shinji, and it's very easy to see where Anno found the roots of Evangelion, the roots of Shinji, and it's here. You know, we're talking about cosmic horror. What is Eva if not cosmic horror? So Gunbuster, by the pure merits of the fact that it's basically proto-Evangelion, already shows a huge ton of depth, despite stealing from at least 8 texts that I've mentioned here in this video. And it pilfered and it remixed and it stirred all of these into some giant intertextual soup, and it took a sip from it, and the resulting broth, you know, gently simmered in the back of your mouth, giving you the rich, pungent sense of, I don't know where this food metaphor is going, but the point that I'm trying to get at is that it made something so exciting and novel that the stuff that it came up with not only sufficed for Gunbuster, but also made one of the best anime of all time. Some would say the best. So with all that in mind, with all the thievery that Gunbuster has engaged with, and its successful final product, why is it that Diesel is ridiculed for its theft of Araki's ideas? Why is it that we find Diesel at the Antipode of inspiration, at the nadir of creativity? Why do people take so much offense against Diesel's use of Araki's ideas? Is it maybe that Diesel didn't change the elements that it stole enough? Right, Gunbuster did a lot to change and to modify. You know, Exelion doesn't look a lot like the Macross. The Ideon eye catch isn't exactly the same. You know, all these like little modifications does enough to make Gunbuster feel like its own original thing. And moreover, maybe people just don't recognize the anime that Gunbuster is referencing because they're too old, because Gunbuster is too subtle with it. Whereas Diesel suffered because, you know, it still kept the name Stand. It used exactly the same plot beats as the Geb fight from part 3. So is it maybe that Diesel didn't modify enough, you know, like the classic, hey, can I take a look at your homework? I won't copy, I'll just change some things to make sure no one notices, right? And Diesel didn't quite change it enough, but Gunbuster did, and Gunbuster got away with it. Well, I doubt it. I mean, that's one argument to make, but I think it's probably one of the most flawed ones. Probably the most dull one as well. Consider the fact that Gunbuster literally points to Aim for the Ace in its title. Gunbuster is no less subtle about the fact that it's stealing from other works than Diesel is, but Diesel still gets a lot of shit. Now, in that case, maybe the opposite is true. Gunbuster stole from a lot of things, so that when each individual element was put together, it does make this new compelling work. Maybe Diesel didn't steal from enough discrete works to feel like it deserves to be its own thing, right? In the same way that Araki steals from so many different things all at once, and when it all comes together in Jojo, when you see classical art being referenced alongside fashion poses, that's when a new work is formed. But I would argue, you know, Diesel does steal from a lot of things. Yes, the core of it is from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The stands and the Geb fights are all from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but isn't that all framed in like this weird Americanized, hard-boiled 90s aesthetic? Isn't that a satisfying remix in and of itself? Doesn't that combine very disparate elements and smash them together to create something new and meaningful? I'd argue yes, but to look at this frame where we see the Jotaro substitution, the Americanized Jotaro who is called Diesel, isn't there something very odd and awkward about the way he yells enemy stand and it's just like cropped in on his face? Doesn't this feel more like a parody and less like a well-meaning pastiche? And it's not that Gunbuster didn't parody the works that it referenced as well. The entire first section of the first episode is a bunch of people working out and exercising the way you would expect from a sports anime. They're all training to become better pilots, but they're doing that in their mechas. And so it's a bunch of mechas doing sit-ups, it's a bunch of mechas doing push-ups, and it turns into this weird, absurdist parody of a standard scene from your run-of-the-mill sports anime. So parody can be done well, even if you are referencing works in a well-meaning way. So what about Diesel makes this parody feel so unrewarding and awkward to read and kind of sends you into that weird uncanny valley pit of reading JoJo but in this very odd art style? And I think now we are getting closer to the crux of the matter, because is Diesel actually a parody? Is it supposed to be something that we laugh at because it makes fun of Jojo in a way that we're familiar with? Is it supposed to be a comedy? And I think the resounding answer is no. And I think that's what people really dislike about Diesel and what makes it so funny and awkward and weird and obviously very derivative to the reader in a way that Gunbuster wasn't. I don't think Diesel understood what the essence of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is, what the core values at its heart are. It's easy to, pastiche and parody the stuff that's very superficial, like the poses, which a lot of people do. A lot of people parody that in their own manga. And it's easy to mimic some of the other stuff, like the go 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 sound effects, or do 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 do, or any of the other sound effects, mimeta, zukyung, right? Like all this other stuff. Just that alone is evidence that the superficial elements of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure can certainly be mimicked, but when we actually see a whole stand fight being imitated, then we're straying further and further away from parody and humor right into plagiarism. Episode 1 of Gunbuster took a lot from shoujo dramas that it references, epitomized kind of by the fact that they're referencing Aim for the Ace in the title. The idea of a rivalry, the idea of being bullied by your seniors, the idea of not feeling like you deserve the respect of your peers is certainly something that shows up again and again. Those themes are all there, not just in a superficial manner, but that first episode is entirely dedicated to telling a complete story within that genre. And it's that level of dedication that Diesel lacks. In the same way that Purple Haze Feedback, which is as much a fan work in my opinion as Diesel, as 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, which we did the previous fanalysis on, as much as those two works understood the essence of stand fights, that it's not just about, two spirit things whacking at each other, one going ora 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 and the other going muda muda muda. It's more about the two characters controlling their stands, and the stand power is about their own psychic failings and misunderstandings and flaws as a human being. And when these two stands go at each other, it's those two, clusters of failures, essentially. These characters' failings as a human being thrown at each other, and the victorious one is the one that grows from the fight, the one that learns a lesson. And it is obviously the case, as we know from reading so much JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, that the loser is the one that is often going, I can't believe I lost, how did I lose, I am the strongest. Right? Like, that's such a cliche JoJo line, but it serves a purpose because the winner is the one that didn't have that hubris and deservedly won. Diesel doesn't seem to recognize this at all. The winner, Diesel, is this very Americanized, muscle-headed jock that is basically just down to beat people up and kills 2 people in like the first 2 pages, if I'm remembering correctly. Like, is that really the kind of person who we want with a stand as powerful as Star Platinum? Is this really who we want replacing Jotaro? No, because Jotaro didn't kill people. Yeah, he did beat up Steely Dan pretty bad, but let's face it, Steely Dan had that coming to him. But did those two guards didn't even have a stand? And what did Jotaro promise within the first few chapters of Stardust Crusaders? I will use my stand to bring to justice those people who would abuse this power against the weak. And that's a very powerful sentiment that Diesel seemingly just skips over in service of being this incredibly dull, hard-boiled plagiarization. I wouldn't even give it the dignity of calling it an adaptation of Stardust Crusaders, of Jotaro's journey to save his mother. The end result for Diesel is that instead of making JoJo's Bizarre Adventure into this Americanized journey, which, ironically, Part 7 ended up doing much better than Diesel even started doing. But Part 3 specifically, Stardust Crusaders, Diesel did try to give us an Americanized Stardust Crusaders, perhaps touching upon themes that are most relevant to an American audience, but with all of the added flexibility and the creativity that stand fights allow for. Where does Diesel take advantage of that opportunity to say boldly that yes, I have been inspired by JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but I have my own story to tell, I have my own values to express. Traits of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, like stand fights and stands, shouldn't necessarily be unique to that series. I find value in them and I want to express myself using them. Wouldn't that be a much more interesting and positive message for Diesel to have told, instead of just saying, I like Stardust Crusaders and I'm going to use the most popular American art style of my time in order to copy it into English? Because is there a lower bar for art to aim for than simply to imitate? So yeah, for fan works, For those of you who are excited by, Jojo fan works as I am, I'd say this is the lesson that Diesel teaches. Don't just take the superficial lessons of, whatever it is you're stealing from. Don't just say, oh, Jojo is about poses, Jojo is about color swaps, Jojo is about sound effects, Jojo is about fashion and crazy hairdos, and there's a guy with 4 testicles, whoa! And there's these ghosts that punch each other, and only people with these ghosts can see the other ghosts, and they all have special powers, and it's awesome! No, that's exactly the kind of parody that you don't want to fall into. It's not about mimicking and imitating these surface values. It's about understanding the core arguments that Jojo is trying to make about the self, about what it means to, have a stand. And the more you think about that, and the more you wrestle with it, and the more you find yourself engaging with those ideas, I think the stronger your fan work will be. Unless, of course, you were aiming to do a parody all along, in which case go absolutely crazy with everything that I've just dictatorially outlawed. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say. If you haven't already seen me talking about 5 meters of Jekyll and Hyde, I think that's a really good preface to everything I talk about in here. If you haven't seen Gunbuster, then this video probably made very little sense, but I highly recommend it. It's the anime that broke anime for me. I don't think I've watched, more than 5 shows after I finished Gunbuster earlier this year. It really is just mind-blowingly good. And its sequel, Diebuster, which I may make a video on very soon, is very much worth watching as well. And the reason I'm making that video is to defend that statement, that it is worth watching. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think about this. I'd love to get some discussion going on this aspect of fan works in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, because I think, the vast majority of fan works, sadly, and stuff like fan stands, for example, are just too consumed by the idea that it has to be fabulous, right? That JoJo is about being extra, in a word, extravagant, to be more verbose. And if we can really wrap our heads around what exactly it is that stands can give us and why they're important, then I think it will be a huge step forward for what fan works can be in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. A great example of that, like I said before, is 5 meters of Jekyll and Hyde, which, as I've said, I do have a similar video that analyzes it from the perspective of a fan. With all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you for the next one.